28 years. That's not a number you just say and move on. That's a man's entire adult life gone. I spent 28 years working homicides. First 8 with NYPD, then 2 decades on Chicago's Unsolved Homicides Task Force. In all that time, the cases that stayed with me weren't always the ones we couldn't solve. Sometimes it was the ones we got wrong. The ones where someone sat in a cell counting days while the real killer walked free. This is one of those cases, and I need you to understand, this isn't rare. This is a documented pattern. The Innocence Project has exonerated over 240 people using DNA evidence alone. Their median time served before exoneration, more than 14 years. Some served decades. Some died waiting. Today I'm walking you through exactly how this happens. Not as a news story, as a case study. Because if you understand the mechanism, the real documented mechanism, you'll never look at a conviction the same way again. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. We go deep here every week. Real cases, real forensics, real consequences. Hit that button before we're done. Let me start at the beginning of where these cases go wrong. A murder happens in a residential neighborhood. It's a violent crime. Neighbors hear something, maybe a fight, maybe a scream. Somebody calls it in. Police arrive, secure the scene, and immediately start canvassing. This is standard procedure. You talk to everyone in a 3-block radius. You're looking for witnesses. And in almost every wrongful conviction case involving a neighbor, you find a witness. Sometimes multiple witnesses. They saw someone. They describe a person. The description is general: height, approximate age, clothing, race. That description matches someone nearby, someone the witness already knows by sight, if not by name. This is where tunnel vision begins. Not maliciously, not always, but it begins. Law enforcement zeroes in on this individual. He fits the general description. He lives close enough that he could have been at the scene. Maybe he had a prior record, something minor, something unrelated, but it creates a profile. And once investigators build a mental profile of a suspect, confirmation bias takes over. The research on this is extensive. It's not controversial in forensic psychology. It's established fact. Now here's the piece that most people don't understand about eyewitness identification. It is the single most unreliable form of evidence in the criminal justice system, and yet it remains the most persuasive to juries. Studies published in peer-reviewed journals going back decades document this gap. We feel certain about what we see. Certainty is not accuracy. Cross-racial identification makes it worse, significantly worse. This is documented in forensic science literature. When a witness identifies someone of a different race, the error rate increases substantially. This isn't an opinion. This has been replicated in controlled studies across multiple research institutions. The brain processes familiar faces differently from unfamiliar ones, and racial familiarity plays a role in that processing. A witness of one race identifying a suspect of a different race is operating with a measurably degraded system. In these neighborhood cases, you often have exactly that dynamic. The witness has had limited interaction with the suspect. They've seen him in passing, on a porch, across a parking lot, under specific lighting conditions, at a specific time of day. Their brain stored a rough representation, not a detailed one. And then they're asked to make an identification, often days later. Here's what the research also tells us about lineup procedures at the time most of these convictions happened. The standard procedure was a simultaneous lineup, all photos or all persons shown at once. The witness compares faces against each other rather than comparing each face against their memory. This produces more identifications, including more wrong ones. The witness doesn't say none of them match. They pick the best fit, even if the best fit isn't close enough. We now know sequential lineups, showing one person at a time, produce fewer false identifications. We know double-blind administration, where the officer running the lineup doesn't know who the suspect is, prevents inadvertent cueing. These reforms have been adopted in states across the country, but those reforms came after decades of wrongful convictions. For the men who sat in those cells, the reforms came too late. So the witness makes an identification. The case moves forward. Now let's talk about the investigation itself. In a properly run homicide investigation, you build a case from the evidence out. You follow the physical evidence. You establish forensic timelines. You don't start with a suspect and build a case toward him. But tunnel vision doesn't announce itself. Investigators believe they have the right person. They're looking for confirmation. Forensic testing in older cases was often inadequate by today's standards. DNA profiling wasn't widely available until the late 1980s and early 1990s. And even when it became available, not every jurisdiction had the resources or the protocol to test every piece of biological evidence. Hair analysis, once considered legitimate forensic science, has since been largely discredited. The FBI issued a formal acknowledgement that analysts had overstated the certainty of microscopic hair analysis in hundreds of cases. Bite mark analysis, blood typing, fiber analysis, multiple forensic disciplines used as evidence in convictions have been reevaluated. When the wrongfully convicted man went to trial, the physical evidence may have been minimal. The eyewitness identification was the spine of the case. The prosecution built this narrative around that identification. The defense, often under-resourced, couldn't effectively challenge the forensic claims or the identification science. Because in many of these cases, the public defender's office was operating with caseloads that made thorough investigation nearly impossible. The jury convicted, the sentence was long, the appeals failed, and through all of it, through every filing, every denied motion, every lost appeal, the real killer was somewhere else, living a life, maybe right back in that neighborhood. Now I want to talk about what the real perpetrator's profile often looks like in hindsight, because this is where cases like this become instructive in a different way. The actual killer in these neighborhood cases often displayed behavioral patterns after the wrongful conviction that in retrospect were red flags. Behavioral science and criminal profiling both document this. Killers who escape justice don't always go quiet. Some become emboldened. Some escalate. Some display a pattern of proximity to violence. Other incidents in their circle. Other victims. Other brushes with law enforcement that were never connected. In some documented wrongful conviction cases, the actual perpetrator made statements to people in their community. Not confessions, not always, but statements that, assembled together years later, formed a damning picture. A comment here, a detail about the crime that only the killer could know, a habit of bringing up the case unprompted. People around them noticed, but they weren't the ones being interviewed. Investigators were focused on the man already convicted. This is why cold case reviews matter. This is why wrongful conviction organizations don't just work to free the innocent. They work to identify who actually did it. Because the cases almost never close clean. The real perpetrator left traces. In those traces, you find the truth. Let me tell you what the Innocence Project actually does, because people have a vague idea of it, but not the mechanics. The Innocence Project, founded in 1992 at Cardozo School of Law, takes cases where post-conviction DNA testing has the potential to prove innocence. They review thousands of applications. They accept cases where biological evidence was collected, was properly preserved, and where DNA testing could produce a definitive result. That's a narrow window. Not every case has that biological evidence. Not every piece was preserved. Some was destroyed. Some was lost. When they identify a viable case, they petition for access to evidence. Jurisdictions don't always cooperate. Evidence rooms misplace things. Prosecutors sometimes resist, not because they're villains, but because reopening a case challenges everything their office built. The resistance is institutional, not always individual, but it's real, and it creates delays measured in years. When DNA testing is finally done on preserved biological evidence, the results are binary. Either the profile matches the convicted man, or it doesn't. In the cases the Innocence Project has won, it didn't match. And when that profile is run against the National DNA Database, CODIS, sometimes it returns a hit. Sometimes it identifies who actually committed the crime. The man still living freely, never suspected, never charged. That moment, when the database returns a name, is not a dramatic courtroom scene. It's a report. It's a number on a screen. And then it begins the work of rebuilding a case, re-interviewing witnesses, presenting findings to a court. The exoneration process itself is not fast. You file a petition for post-conviction relief. The prosecution reviews it. Sometimes they concede. Sometimes they fight it. There are hearings. There are counter-arguments. There are cases where prosecutors, even faced with DNA evidence, argued the wrongfully convicted man could still have been involved, that he was an accomplice, that the DNA proved nothing. These arguments have been made. They are documented in court records. Eventually, in cases where the evidence is overwhelming, a judge vacates the conviction. The man walks out, and that's where the story should end in a just world. But it doesn't. 28 years. Let me tell you what that actually means for a human being. The Innocence Project has published extensive data on the impact of wrongful incarceration. The exonerees they've represented, people who collectively lost thousands of years of freedom, share a documented set of consequences. It is not abstract. It is clinical. Family relationships fractured or destroyed. Children grew up without a parent. Spouses divorced. Parents died while their son was inside for something he didn't do. The bonds that would have anchored a life, gone or permanently strained. Career and economic loss. An exoneree emerging after 28 years has no employment history from those decades, no professional skills that translate to the modern labor market, no savings, no pension, no property. They often emerge with the clothes they wore at sentencing, which don't fit anymore, and a small release payment from the state that doesn't begin to cover what was lost. Physical health consequences. Prison health care is inadequate by any documented measure. Chronic conditions go undertreated. Mental health deteriorates in long-term incarceration. PTSD rates among exonerees are documented and high, comparable to combat veterans and survivors of severe trauma. The hypervigilance developed as a survival mechanism inside doesn't switch off when the gates open. Reintegration is documented as extremely difficult. The world has changed. Technology has changed. Social norms have changed. An exoneree has no credit history, no stable housing, no established support network outside of family that may have drifted away. Studies on reentry after long-term incarceration show high rates of economic instability, even in people who have not been wrongfully convicted. For exonerees, the difficulty compounds. Now let's talk about what legal remedy exists, because people assume exoneration means compensation. It doesn't. Not automatically. Not adequately. Only 37 states have wrongful conviction compensation laws. 13 states have no statute providing any automatic compensation to someone who was wrongfully convicted and imprisoned. In states that do have laws, the compensation formulas vary widely. Some cap payouts at levels that, divided across decades of lost life, amount to a few $1,000s a year of freedom stolen. Some place conditions on eligibility. Prior felony convictions can disqualify someone entirely, even if that prior record had nothing to do with the wrongful conviction. The National Registry of Exonerations has documented cases where men served decades and received no compensation because they happened to live in a state without a statute and their civil lawsuit failed on procedural grounds. Qualified immunity. Statutes of limitation. The legal barriers to recovery can be as tall as the barriers to exoneration itself. Civil suits against municipalities and police departments do sometimes succeed. Settlements in documented wrongful conviction cases have ranged from modest to significant, but settlements require litigation, which requires time and resources. And even large settlements, multi-million-dollar settlements, don't restore the lost decades. They don't give back the childhood milestones a parent missed. They don't reconstruct the relationships. Money is the only remedy the legal system has. It is never sufficient. This is documented. Advocates don't argue that compensation laws are adequate. They argue that having them is better than not having them. That's the baseline. What has changed because of cases like this one? Something has, and it's worth acknowledging. Eyewitness identification reform is the most significant area. Following research and advocacy tied directly to wrongful conviction cases, a number of states have passed laws mandating sequential lineup procedures. Several have required double-blind administration, meaning the officer who knows who the suspect is cannot be present when the witness views the lineup. Some jurisdictions now require video recording of all eyewitness identification procedures, creating a record of how the identification was conducted, what instructions were given, and how confident the witness appeared before they were told whether they'd chosen the suspect. These aren't cosmetic changes. Sequential lineups and controlled studies produce measurably fewer false identifications. The reform works, but adoption is uneven across the country. Local police departments have discretion over their procedures in many states. Progress has been inconsistent. DNA evidence protocols have also changed. Biological evidence preservation requirements have been strengthened in many jurisdictions. Evidence destruction before a prisoner has exhausted their appeals has been restricted in some states. The ability of convicted individuals to petition for DNA testing of preserved evidence has been expanded. These are legislative changes tied directly to cases where that evidence was the difference between dying in prison and walking free. Forensic science oversight has increased scrutiny. The National Commission on Forensic Science, which existed between 2013 and 2017 before its mandate expired, raised standards and flagged discredited techniques. Ongoing work by the Innocence Project and affiliated organizations continues to push for peer review requirements for forensic methods used in court. None of this undoes what was done to the wrongfully convicted man in this case pattern. It doesn't undo what was done to the 240 plus people the Innocence Project has exonerated. It doesn't undo the time served by the thousands of others documented in the National Registry of Exonerations, which now counts over 3,000 documented exonerations in the United States. 3,000. That's not a rounding error. That's a systematic failure. I've worked homicides for 28 years. I've seen what happens when investigators get it right. And I've seen what happens when the process fails, when the pressure to close a case overrides the rigor that case deserves. Pressure is real in this work. A family is waiting for justice. A community is afraid. Leadership wants results. I understand that pressure. I felt it. But the man who sits in a cell for decades for something he didn't do, he's a victim too. He was victimized twice. Once by the killer who committed the crime and escaped accountability, and again by a system that put the wrong man away and fought to keep him there. The real killer committed murder. Then he let someone else serve the time. He watched the neighbor's life dissolve and did nothing. That's not just the original crime. That's 28 years of ongoing harm, compounding, unremedied. When exoneration finally comes, there's no ceremony adequate to what happened. A judge signs an order, a door opens. A man walks out into a world that moved on without him, and then he has to figure out how to live in it. Let me go deeper on the DNA testing process, because most people don't understand what it actually involves when we're talking about old evidence. Biological evidence from a crime scene, blood, hair, saliva, skin cells, degrades over time. Heat, humidity, light exposure all accelerate degradation. Evidence stored in an unconditioned warehouse over decades may be partially or fully unusable. This is a documented problem across jurisdictions. Evidence rooms are not always climate controlled. Chain of custody documentation from older cases is sometimes incomplete. Finding a sample that's still viable for DNA testing 30 years after a crime requires luck as much as diligence. When viable samples are found, the testing itself uses short tandem repeat analysis, STR profiling. This produces a genetic profile with billions to one uniqueness. If the profile from the crime scene evidence doesn't match the convicted man's profile, that's not ambiguous. That's elimination. It's not a probability. It's a binary result. The challenge then becomes proving that the evidence is uncontaminated. Prosecutors in these cases sometimes argue that old evidence may have been contaminated, that the DNA found belongs to a technician, a detective, someone who handled the evidence years ago. This argument gets made. Laboratories counter it with documentation of handling procedures, with negative control samples, with chain of custody records. Courts evaluate the credibility of that challenge. In most documented exoneration cases, the contamination argument fails. The science is too specific. When the DNA profile is run through CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the national database of profiles from convicted offenders and crime scenes, and it returns a match. That match is a starting point. Investigators then have to build the case against the newly identified person. They have to interview witnesses again, sometimes 30 years later. Memories have faded. Witnesses have died. The newly identified suspect may have developed relationships and alibis over decades. Prosecution of the actual perpetrator in wrongful conviction cases is often difficult, precisely because of how much time has passed. Some cases result in prosecution and conviction of the real killer. Others don't achieve that. The evidence of guilt exists in DNA, but the criminal case can't be built to a standard that produces a conviction beyond reasonable doubt 3 decades later. The exoneree goes free. The real killer may not face trial. That's another layer of injustice that doesn't get enough attention. What I want you to take from this is not despair. I want you to take the mechanism. Understand the cross-racial identification problem. Understand tunnel vision in investigations. Understand that forensic techniques we trusted weren't always valid. Understand that compensation laws are inadequate and unevenly distributed. Understand that reform has happened and needs to continue, because the cases we never revisit are the ones where no one raised those questions, where no one looked back. The Innocence Project looks back. Cold case review units look back. And sometimes looking back is the only thing that separates a man dying in prison from a man walking free. If you made it this far, you already know you care about getting this right. Subscribe. We cover cases like this every week. The full picture, the real forensics, the documented consequences. Not sensationalism, not speculation, evidence. I'm Marcus Cole. I'll see you next week.